Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, thank you very much for having me today. And as Hina said, I'm going to talk to you about the generational shifts that we've seen and the impact that that has. And maybe what are some of the things in common that we have across the generations, and what have been some of the shifts that we've experienced in work. And then taking that forward, with the pace of change that we're constantly seeing, what might the organisation of the future look like, and how can we make that a really compelling place to start? So we have a really great large audience here, so let's just see what the spread is. I'm not going to ask you to reveal your actual age, you're okay. So none of you have to lie, but could you put your hands up if you were born before 1965? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So you're known as the baby boomers, if you've ever heard that term before, so you're still young. What about, can you put your hand up if you were born between 1965 and 1983? Okay, so big proportion here. So you're Generation X, which is me also, so you're in very good company. And then what about if you were born, say, 1984 to 2000? How many here? Okay, so a smaller proportion. So you're known as Generation Y, also known as Millennials. And then have we got any Generation Z, so people born after 2000? You're lying, madam. You look very young, though. The Botox is working. Okay, so you're Generation Z, and in some companies, they're just now starting to enter the workforce. Hina mentioned I have two children. I have a child in Generation Y and Generation Z, and they're both still on my payroll. So I'm looking forward to the time where they finally go out to work. I guess my little one's only 13, so to be fair, she's got a way to go. So I'm going to paint a picture when I started work as a Generation X, what that was like. And it feels like a lifetime ago now, and so different to today. So I started work, and it was very formal. So formal working hours, you expected to be in at a certain time, no later. If you were late, you got told off, and you weren't allowed to leave before a certain time. And if you had a dentist appointment, you had to basically put your hand up and say, "Please, sir, may I leave early? I've got a dentist appointment." You were very much expected to turn up, and the career that you trained for would be the career that you'd have for life. There was a real respect for hierarchy, so it was a very hierarchical work setting, and I guess to a certain extent it still is today. But you really had to respect the people that were older than you and more senior, and you didn't dare speak up. And if somebody said something and they were more senior than you, even if you disagreed and you knew in your heart of hearts they were wrong, you definitely didn't. You didn't say anything at all. Not really many computers around. A few people, the secretaries had computers. Email was just starting to come into place, and their bosses used to get the secretary to print the email so they could read it, which was quite amusing at the time. Dress code was very formal. I remember one day I turned up in trousers, and almost, but not quite, sent home, but certainly told Rose, you wear a skirt or a dress, please, no trousers to work. And smoking, do you remember smoking? People were smoking in work. All the managers had their offices around the outside, and all us minions were in the middle, and they'd all be smoking, and you'd go in to have a meeting with them. Good afternoon, sir, and sit down and write everything down, and they'd be smoking away, whether you were a smoker or not. Does any of you Generation Xers recognise any of that? Yeah. Okay. Good. It wasn't just me then. And everybody was the same nationality, so there was no real difference, not like you see today. So, and the sum of that really is that when I started work, I thought I'd start a career and end up for life. I had a real respect for hierarchy, and not speaking out of turn. And certainly the flexibility just wasn't there at the beginning. And I love the flexibility. But I've also had to learn technology. So it wasn't in place, certainly not in place at school. And I don't even dare admit, but when I was at school, it was blackboard and chalk. My 13-year-old, I've just had to buy her an iPad for school, so it's really different. So coming on to millennials, so my son is a millennial, so they don't have an expectation of a job for life. They will expect to move around, and a lot of you are Generation Y here. So there's much more flexibility and a degree of comfort, if you like, that you will move jobs quite a few times in your career, and you feel more relaxed and comfortable about leaving a company and going somewhere else. There isn't that disloyalty that I was certainly brought up to believe. And social media plays a much bigger part, so you guys are really comfortable with that. And my son, he's 20, the first thing he does in the morning when he wakes up, not to have a shower, unfortunately, but he goes through his social feed, whatever it's all gobbledygook to me. And then we have the Generation Zs coming into the workplace who are even more comfortable with technology. So my daughter has 2 iPads now, one because she wanted one for Christmas, and then I get the email from school saying you've of course got to buy one. And of course she can't use the old one because it's not consistent with all their security things, and she has a phone. So she's very comfortable with technology, thank God, because she can fix my stuff when it goes wrong. And get the telly working. Why do televisions have so many buttons on the remote control? What is the point of all that? And Generation Zs are much more comfortable with cultural diversity. That's absolutely a given. What I will be really curious as they come into the workplace is what they take or what they make of email. Because Twitter is really what drives them. They're on Twitter and everything's short characters and short text. So as you think about collaborating, you know, if you're a Generation X, how are you going to feel about a Generation Z who might come to work in flip-flops, which I think you did one day, Ian, is that right? You turned up work in flip-flops? How are you going to persuade a Generation Z to keep on top of their email when they're just not going to be motivated to do that? So here are some of the differences. But there are also quite a few things that we all have in common. And I would say there are 4 key things. I'm sure we could all come up with more if we had enough time. But one would be that we all want meaning. We want meaning in our work and meaning in our life. So we want to feel like we're doing something that's really worthwhile and that we're personally motivated by and connected. And the great thing is that we're all different. So that's different for each of us. We also want to work for a company that has a purpose. So when I first started work, it was all about profit. How much money are you making? What's the bottom line? We've got to cut costs. Of course, that's still true. That's how companies survive and grow and keep us all employed. But actually, it's as important that the company emphasises its purpose. And Roche, doing now what patients need next, that's a really meaningful purpose. And that's very important to connect to all of us, no matter. We all want flexibility. You know, gone are the days where you're in work between 9 and 5:30. We've got a lot more to juggle now. Technology's helped us do that, but it also does make it more difficult to switch off. And I think the other point is we all want a boss who cares. And that's been there from the beginning, really. But I think nowadays there's much more of an expectation that really should be the case. And that boss that cares about you as a person, not just a widget, not just doing the performance management process because that's the process that you've got to do because it's that time of year, but actually they genuinely care about you as an individual and they want to know what motivates you. They want to know what development you want. So that real connection is so important to each and every one of us, irrespective of the generations. So if these are the shifts that are taking place in us across the generations, what are some of the organisational shifts? We're just going back to my story of when I started work, how different it is today. Globalisation, this is the Global Safety Organisation. This is global. You know, gone are the days where you work in a department sat next to the same people that you work with. You're part of global teams. Those teams are flexible. They may come, they may go. You may be together for quite a short period of time to work on a project and then dissipate, and then come back together again in another form. So actually, how do you stay connected? At the end of the day, we're people. We want to feel sociable. We want to feel that connection. So how do you do that? I think the second thing, and I'm reading more and more about this, and was at a conference last week where this came up a lot, is artificial intelligence. We've got the march of the robots. is going to, if everything you believe is true, it's going to take over our jobs. So are we scared by that, or actually do we see that as an opportunity? I read something that said that robots can do today 30% of 2/3 of the jobs that are out there. So one could argue that's great because that releases us from the mundane tasks to be more creative. But what it also means that we do need to be agile because the roles are going to constantly change. And that's harder for a Generation X, for example, than maybe a Z, who are much more used to that change. I think the other organisational shift, and really connecting to globalisation, is diversity. You're going to have much more diverse people. You're going to have a mixture of genders, cultures, the ages that we've talked about. And with the Generation Y and Z in particular, they're much more comfortable at speaking up and saying, I don't agree with something. So the art really is to hold that diversity and allow that diversity to come into the discussion and everybody to have their view, and trust that that will then give you a really much more creative outcome. But in some ways it can create a challenge because we've got so much to do that in some ways it might feel like it slows the decision making down, and that can feel frustrating. So it's almost like you've got to have the faith that that's the right thing to do, and then in today's world actually it's a necessary thing to do. And the fourth and final point on organisational shifts is, how do you motivate people to retain them? So as I've said, Generation Y and Z are much more comfortable going. They don't see it as being disloyal to the company. They see it's just kind of part of life. And they may well come back to you in 5 years' time. So how do you retain the best of your people? How do you motivate them to want to stay? Well, in my opinion, a lot of this has to do with mindset, and I've got a couple of slides to show you. Has anybody seen that before? Put your hand up if you're familiar with that. Okay, a few of you. Super, thank you. So this is known as an iceberg diagram, and if you imagine an iceberg, the squiggly blue line is the top of the water. So what you see above the water line is behaviour. But actually the iceberg is massive underneath, and that's what you don't see. So you see what somebody is doing, what their behaviour is, but actually what's driving that behaviour is their mindset. And what's driving mindset is their values, assumptions and beliefs. And a lot of that is how you were brought up. So what was your childhood? What did your parents teach you? Where do you live? What's the kind of norms around you? Who do you work with? And also, of course, your innate personality. So those things. So when you're working with somebody, and maybe they're being difficult or they see something different to you, it'll be because of what's happening underneath that waterline. So if you assume a positive intent for a start, that really helps you. So let me take that into another level of detail. I want to talk to you about a model of mindset that's been defined by a professor of psychology, Carol Dweck. She's at Stanford University, and I think she's pretty much devoted her life, actually, her life's work, to looking at mindset. And she's given two basic definitions: a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And she and her researchers have done a lot of work over the years in school children and in adults, and looked at what happens when you have either one of those two mindsets. So a fixed mindset is somebody that has a fixed mindset believes that their intelligence is fixed, their talents are innate, it's what you're born with, and actually there's not a lot you can do about it. So if you make a mistake, then that's kind of scary thing because it's showing you up, it's telling you what the limit is of your abilities. And what Professor Dweck was able to show was that in school children, they didn't do as well as those with growth mindset because they gave up quite easily because they didn't want to fail. On the other hand, if you have a growth mindset, then actually you're the opposite of that. You believe that your intelligence and your talents can be developed through hard work and perseverance. And actually, if you make mistakes, that's an opportunity to learn. So that's a good thing. They're not scared by it. They almost embrace it. And she did this with school children with complicated maths puzzles, more and more maths puzzles. And in adults, she wired adults up and found that those with a growth mindset, their brain was, that all the processing was much more active because they wanted to get that feedback. Whereas there was much less brain activity in those with a fixed mindset where they made a mistake because they'd kind of already mentally filed it away in the failure category. An example of a growth mindset is actually Google. They've done a lot of research in teams in their own organization, and they looked at 180 teams and looked at those teams that were really successful. And actually the number one component was psychological safety. And I don't know if that kind of intuitively makes sense to you what that means, but it means, do I feel safe to speak up? Can I say what my opinion is without fear of reprisal? It's very difficult for a Generation Xer to do. And have this mindset, we're all in it together. Yes, change is marching on, and we don't know what the future is, but actually, let's trust that we'll figure it out. So, thinking then about actually what does this mean for the workplace of tomorrow? And I think this is a nice analogy to use actually. You've got the heroic leadership and host leadership. And if you think about the superheroes, they're the ones that wear the underpants on their outside of their trousers and say, don't worry, damsel in distress, I'll save you, I'm your superhero, I know what to do, leave it to me. Well, that can really replicate in the workplace as well, where you've got the people at the top that feel they've got to be in control. They're the ones that set the strategy. They tell you what to do, and they make it all better. But the reality is that actually the world of work today ain't like that anymore. There's so much complexity, ambiguity. The future is unknown. You may have a rough idea, but you can't know it in a lot of detail. So I would argue that actually you need to be moving to a host leadership model. And many of you may already have that in your workplace. And if you imagine what a host does, they create the environment. So they don't expect to have all the answers. But what they're really good at is modeling the psychological safety that Google talk about. They're very good at harnessing this diversity of opinion and holding the tension that that inevitably brings, where you've got different viewpoints and it feels like you get stuck at certain points. They're also good at holding the bureaucracy at bay. And in a company like Roche, just by nature of its size, you are going to get bureaucracy at some level. So they really create that. So I would suggest that the host leadership means that all the generations can work together, all the diversity and the richness that that brings with the psychological safety that goes with it will make you a much more agile individual, but also a much more agile company to then really look and go into the future together. So I want to leave you with a summary, 3 key points. The first one is embrace the future. So get curious about what's happening out there. Learn about artificial intelligence. Spot the trends. What are the fast-moving trends that could be happening in safety? And be really clear, what floats your boat? So given that we all want meaning, what are we really motivated to do? What motivates us personally? Because then whatever the future holds for you, you'll be motivated and you'll be good and you'll be skilled at moving into and navigating that future. The second point is learn and then be prepared to unlearn and learn. So the illiterate of the 21st century won't be those that can't read and write, but those that can't learn and then be prepared to kind of unpick that and learn something new. So that agility and adaptability will continue to be really, really important. And share that learning. So thinking about the host leadership model, they share the learning. The growth mindset, it's okay if it works or it doesn't work. Let's take the learning from it and move on. And the last point, and this is where we beat the robots, make it personal. So care about each other, care about your colleagues. If you're a boss, genuinely care about your employees. Take the different viewpoints. Trust, actually, that when it gets messy, that's okay. You'll just kind of work it through. And because everybody will have been involved in the discussion, even if the decision that gets made is not one that they personally would have signed up to, you're much more likely to get people's commitment to it. And finally on that is also the values. Think about what people's values are and how can you connect that to the purpose, Roche's purpose. Because if people feel that personal connection, they're so much more motivated. So the best way, I want to leave you with this point, the best way to predict the future is to create it. So what part will you play in that? Thank you very much.